Alrighty, we are back. Let's consider this part 2, which is going to be getting everything into Substance Painter and baking the mesh. So I'm going to go ahead and close this guy out, and yeah, sure, we'll save it, why not? And let's jump over to Substance Painter. Closing out max will give us a little more RAM. We're going to say new. We're going to leave template the same. If you have UDIMs or cameras you want to import, you'd want to check those then. But all we really need to do is jump up to File, and we're going to import the low poly mesh, not the high poly mesh. So I'm going to say duffel bag underscore low, and say open, and we're going to say open. So this is going to grab our model, and from there we're going to bake our bake the high and low poly together, basically transferring the information from the high poly to this low poly. It allows Substance Painter to kind of read the mesh itself, and we can use cool things like generators and particle effects to help texture this thing. But we'll get into that a little later. But what we're going to do is we're going to go down to, actually let me show you this. So those materials that we added to our model, as you can see, those have all come over. So we have buckles, zippers, handles, stitching, and all that jazz. Again, if we just had one material applied, all we'd have is one. We'd name it something like duffel bag. But since we parted everything out to give them their own UV space, yeah, this is what we end up getting on this side, and each one of these gets its own texture set, again allowing for really high definition textures. But if we go down to this button here, we're going to say bake mesh maps. And what I like to normally do is just kind of do a quick test bake to see if there's any flipped normals or overlapping UVs. So I'll keep it at 512, but what we need to do is specify our high poly mesh at this time. So we're going to click this button, and we'll import our duffel bag underscore high. And now we can just bake one texture set if we need to do or make some adjustments to one texture set, or we can bake them all together. There's going to be some issues with this bake, I know from just testing, which we'll get to kind of just baking one texture set. But let's go ahead and just bake them all, and we'll kind of look at everything after it's done. So see you guys in a second here. Okay, we're back from our bake, and great. Errors, that's exactly what we want to see. It's just the ID maps. What ID maps are is you can assign colors to certain parts of your model and then use those colors to assign materials to. So let's say we made the straps blue or something. We'd say, oh yeah, everything blue, add this texture or something onto it. I just use the heck out of the polygon fill tool, which allows you to do the same thing. So it can be a pain in the butt to have to go back and change color IDs and all this jazz. I've never found it super useful in the workflow that I have. Might be useful to others, but how we get rid of that, just to show you guys, is we turn this off here, and we don't have to worry about it, or the air coming up. It doesn't really matter if the air comes up. We don't have the map in there anyways, just to not alarm you guys. Okay, so why do I do a crappy bake like this? I'm looking for two things: flip normals and issues with, actually three things: flip normals, overlapping UVs, and then issues with normal maps themselves. So let me show you guys some examples here. Flip normals basically looks like your model's inside out. It's like this is what it's supposed to look like on the left by this Blender user. On the right, we have this weird kind of jacked up looking geometry. This generally happens right when you import. I don't think it happens necessarily after baking, but that's one thing I'm looking for. Let's take a look at my other example. Poor or overlapping UVs. You can see it here. It ends up with this weird like camo kind of looking sometimes. You get these weird lines. You see like the edges of other UV islands jumping around. It looks odd. I mean, you guys would know right out of the gate if you had overlapping UVs, but you don't want to do like a 4K bake, wait 30-40 minutes and then realize, oh shit, I got overlapping UVs. So that's another thing we're looking out for. Two, sometimes something will just turn black. That's another issue with UVs. So this whole handle will be black, and it's an overlapping UV issue. And then lastly, we're looking for stuff like this. It's kind of hard to see this kind of lip area underneath. This is caused by issues with normals. The dark is maybe from ambient inclusion, but you could see it looks like it's kind of bumped up. This is again a problem with normals. And actually, let me do a little higher of a bake just on this guy. And actually, this is a cool example of just baking a certain one map out. when doing testing. So I'm going to click on the duffel bag. We're going to go back and we're going to say bake. I'm going to turn off everything but our normal. And let me put this at 1024. And instead of baking all the texture sets, we're just going to bake the duffel bag mesh here. And I'll explain something here. I have another graphic. Here we go. So if this looks a little intimidating, I'll kind of explain this. The white boxes are low poly mesh. The green boxes are nice, smooth, detailed, high poly mesh. And then we have these rays that are shot up by Substance Painter. These rays read your mesh, so anything that is above your mesh or below your mesh, like height or depth information, it uses these rays to kind of figure out the high poly version versus the low poly version. All that detail that Oasim is sculpting into ZBrush, it wants to read that. However, they have distances. So let me draw on this here. So for example's sake, let's say we had some of the model was pushed out above the white 0.5, so it can read that, right? Then we have another part that's pushed out into the mesh at a distance of 0.1, right? It'll read that. But what if we have a distance of like 0.02? What if this goes all the way down here and comes back like a divot or a scratch or something like that? Make that a 2. And we have this distance only set to 1. It's only going to read to this line. It's not going to get all this other information. And you get some weird looking baking artifacts happening in Painter itself. So again, here's a kind of more of it. What's happening is these rays are traveling too far. In this case, what I think is happening, do I want to get rid of that? Yeah, we'll get rid of that. I think the front ray is going too far. It's piercing the top. It's continuing to go down, and it's projecting some of this top lid on the base of this bag, which isn't good. So we need to shorten the front ray up. We don't need it to travel as far. Alternatively, let's say we have a divot. Let me see if I can find something over here. No, this is all good. Like some of these divots and some of these like cracks in here, if they weren't showing up, maybe the rear distance isn't far enough. The rays going into the model aren't far enough. If I get back to that picture here. Yeah, this front ray is going too far. And then if they have like cracks that aren't coming through enough, or the crack just goes down and then stops. So something like if it just looks like this, like there's more information down here, but it's not seeing that information because the ray is stopping at 0.01. That's when we need to start playing with this. It's called frontal distance and rear distance. Let me show you guys how to mess with that. So in here, here you go, frontal distance and rear distance. So it's kind of, these numbers are kind of arbitrary to some extent with your model and the scale of the model. We just kind of have to play with them a bit, which is a pain in the butt. But this is why it's nice to just bake the normal map and just for the map that or the texture set that you need, so you don't have to wait through the entire thing to bake. So let's just see, for example's sake, I found that 0.05 worked okay. Let's go ahead and kick this off, and we'll take a look and see. You'll see that it cleared that up, so that ray is no longer traveling through. Now let's do your ambient occlusion as well, because some of that information is coming through as well. So the ray is no longer traveling through the top little lid of the bag and then hitting the base of the bag. Again, it's just not traveling that far. See? So it gets all that cleared up. Another way to clear things up in case, let's say the strap was doing this instead of the top of the bag. Let's say the strap was causing some issues down here on the bag. There's another setting here called match, where always it matches no matter what is touching what, but we can say by mesh name. And what this does is the strap will only project more information onto the strap itself and no other objects in the scene. And the same deal with the bag. The bag won't project any onto the strap. The strap won't project any on the bag. Now that setting wouldn't help us here because the bag, this bag here is all one piece, right? So if the lid was separate, that setting would cause it to not project from the lid to the base. But this is all one object, so that wouldn't necessarily work. All right, is there anything else we need to cover? Let me check some notes. I think that's it. So yeah, again, this only pops up when we're dealing with high to low baking. If you just have a mesh you're baking out and not doing a high-res mesh baking normals, you normally don't have to deal with the frontal. You can leave it just kind of at stock. And a lot of times too, you can leave this number at 0.01 and it's fine. You can get away with the bake. But if you do have issues, again, start raising or lowering these values just by a smidge, not very much, and you'll kind of get everything cleaned up. So what I'll do is I will turn all these back on, with the exception of ID because we don't have those. And I'm going to do a 4K bake here and we'll kick this off. So once this is done, we will get to texturing and we can go from there. So I'll see you guys once this is done baking. Okay, so everything has finished. Let's go ahead and take a look. If I click OK, we're no longer getting those projection issues from the lid to the base of the bag. Everything else looks good. Got our ambient occlusion looking all smooth. Again, this is due to higher bake settings. Some of the blotchiness in the stitches has all gone away. So this is all looking good. So now that we've got baking under our belts, let's jump over to part 3 and we'll deal with adding materials to this object. I'll see you guys in part 3.